Hello everyone, this is my second take on the recap of round 7 of Altibox Norway Chess 2018. The first one I had to stop somewhat midway because I realized that it will work better if I switch the microphone on. As a result of this, I am perhaps not as cheerful as I was 10 minutes ago, but I very much hope it will not impact the quality of the video too much. My apologies if it ends up doing so. Anyway, in round 7, as was the case in most rounds in this tournament, there was only one decisive game, and this is the game we will be covering. So let's jump into the action. We're talking about the game that Maxim Vasiliy played with white against Vishy Anand. Maxim, as he normally does, goes e4. And in reply, Vishy goes for the Spanish, which is quite normal, and then plays knight takes e4 on move 5, playing the open variation of the Spanish, which is something he used to do very, very regularly in the late 90s, maybe early noughts. The game he played on the black side of the open that most people remember is a very, very spectacular game. He lost to Garry Kasparov in their World Championship match in '95, but that's probably a bit unfair because it's only one loss in a reasonably successful history. But he hasn't been doing a lot of the Open recently, and this is an interesting return to sort of old hunting grounds for Vishy. d4, b5, bishop b3, d5, takes bishop b6, central variation, I mean the starting position of the Open variation, you can say. And MVL starts with c3. I will not attempt to explain why c3 in MVL's opinion is the more precise move than knight bd2, because I simply don't know, and it would take me way too much time to try and figure it out, and I'm not convinced I would be able to do so on the fly. But it's obviously a very possible move order. It allows some things and disallows some other things, so why not? Vishy decides not to try and refute it and goes bishop b7, knight bd2 castles. This already transposes back to knight bd2 lines, rook e1, knight c5, knight d4. And this line was quite popular, let's say 10 to 15 years ago. I personally played it with white at least once with decent success. And Vishy's reply to it, I think, is the most critical option black has. Vishy takes on d4 and plays knight d3, rook e3, and knight f4 here. And this is a very, very sharp position. Black obviously wants to play c5 and create a lot of counterplay in the center, whereas white, well, currently has a stable situation in the center. And also, as is quite usual for positions where white has this pawn center against the black king, so to speak, if he can manage to activate his pieces properly and aim them at the black king, he could generate a surprising amount of initiative on the king side. And I believe already the first move that MVL played here is not exactly the best option. I think the best move here for white is probably bishop c2, with the intention of meeting c5 with rook g3. And I've drawn some arrows here already because I got to this point in the video once before. And as you can see from the arrows, white is sidestepping the rook before playing knight f3, so that both the bishops, the rook on g3 and the knight on f3, they all are very, very threatening towards the black king. One very concrete explanation for this idea was shown in the game between Zoltan Almash and Viktor Erdos. Viktor played bishop h4, knight f3, takes, knight g6, d takes c5. And it's quite obvious white has tremendous compensation for the exchange here, potentially protected passer on c5, plus a fantastic square on d4 for his pieces, and black ended up not managing to hold this. 2 years later, Jan Timman played knight g6 here against Almash, knight f3 and rook c8, and this game did finish in a draw, but also was extremely sharp after knight g5. Instead of all this, MVL played knight f3, which looks extremely natural, of course, but allows bishop g4. And now the knight is pinned, and the knight on f4 is aiming, well, not aiming, it will land there. it gets to the absolute best square available to this piece in all these types of structures in the open Spanish, which is the square e6, where it controls some very important squares on the king side, stops, for instance, all ideas of knight g5, at least in any kind of near future, making it much harder for white to generate the attack on the king side, and also very well supports very well the potential c7, c5 break. MVL played h3, bishop h5, rook c3, knight e6. And here we kind of glossed over this during the live show with Jan, but the decision to play g4 is already quite questionable, because you can definitely start with bishop e3 without committing to g4 this early. c5, you definitely will meet with g4, but that's quite obviously a much improved version, because black will start to have will have to sacrifice something, because bishop g6, dc5 is more or less lost for him. And if black tries playing like he does in the game, for instance a6, a5, white once again can play either rook c6 first or rook ac1 first. Both are very playable. And in general, like the simple way to explain this would be to say that white, in most cases, eventually probably will have to play g4 to unpin himself on the king side. But there is absolutely no reason for him to do that until black forces him and makes this commitment unavoidable. Maxim played g4 quite quickly, though, probably feeling that this position is quite good, because normally black would like to play something like queen d7 and maybe rook c8, once again trying to support the c5 break. But white does have the idea of playing rook c6, following it up with rook ac1, and establishing very good control over the c-file. And if that rook lands on c6, white will do quite well. But a5, which is what Vishy replied with, is a very good countermeasure against this. Black's idea simply is to play a4, bishop c2, and then, well, I mean, the immediate threat is a4, bishop c2, bishop b4, kind of capturing the rook on c3. You will see a similar variation in the game. But also in many cases, for instance, after rook ac1 here, black has the additional option of playing rook a6, preventing white from that setup where white has two rooks on the c-file, which is quite good for black. And also, you have to notice that on the king side, white's normal plan of action would be to move that knight away somewhere and push f4, f5. But the way the black pieces are positioned, the moment that happens, black can play f7, f5, more or less completely stopping those ideas. So it's very difficult for white to generate anything at all on the king side. MVL plays bishop c2 here, and from this moment onwards, the game becomes very, very sharp. And I have to say that almost at every turning point in the game, Vishy manages to more or less conclusively outcalculate his much younger opponent, which is not a thing that very many people can say about their games against MVL. MVL is a tremendous calculator in sharp positions, and it's very, very difficult to come out ahead in such fights. After bishop c2, Vishy plays bishop b4, and already here I was only somewhat, only to a very small degree tongue-in-cheek, I was suggesting that if MVL doesn't actually play bishop takes g6 here, it probably means that it's not MVL, and it's somebody wearing an MVL mask, perhaps masquerading as our beloved French player, because rook b3 just doesn't look right. Equilibrium is not actually disturbed by playing rook b3, but bishop takes g6 was very playable here. Vishy probably would take on c3, because if you take on g6, rook c6, then the point of bishop b4 is not obvious. You've wasted a tempo on nothing. In some positions, fg6 is quite clever, but here after rook c6, queen e8, rook ac1, once again we return to the fact that this is a very, very strong piece on c6, and I don't think black needs to be allowing this. So bishop takes c3, and during the live broadcast we were kind of concentrated on this position, which I correctly assessed as better for black during the show, but I wasn't sure about how much better, and the answer to that question is quite a bit. This is not great for white. And chat kept on suggesting to me that white can play bishop b1 here, which I sort of disregarded, because I thought the idea would be after bishop b4, to win the b5 pawn back. But then black goes rook b8, followed by c7, c5, and this will just collapse for white. This is horrible. But the computer actually suggests that the whole point of bishop b1 is not to play queen d3, but to play queen c2, g6, a3, bishop e7, and queen c6. This is a very typical tactic you see in a lot of positions in the open Spanish, where white gives up this exchange. But once the queen lands on c6, it becomes very, very difficult for black, the way his pieces are positioned, not to lose the d5 pawn because of the threat of bishop a2. And play can, for instance, continue before bishop a2, takes, rook b8, takes, knight g5. And here the computer suggests that you can take with the bishop, and in this position it seems to think that securing the a pawn on a light square is the best way to proceed. And it assesses this position as virtual equality because black can return with the bishop to e7, white sets up some kind of a light squared domination with, I don't know, queen g2, bishop e4, queen somewhere. And there is just enough compensation for the exchange here for white not to be worried about things very much. So bishop takes g6, in view of this idea of queen c2 on move 23, followed by a3 and queen c6, would have been a playable option for white, but you cannot really blame MVL for not finding it. I'm sure he considered bishop takes g6 very seriously, but unless you see this particular idea of queen c2, queen c6, you should not be doing that. Sort of as an end result to all that, I think rook b3 is an understandable decision, but a somewhat sad decision. Look at this rook, it's really not doing very much. And Vishy goes f5 in reply, and people in chat were very, very surprised and very impressed that Vishy made this move, because it was the machine's first line, and people were saying that this is kind of inhuman to play like this. But I think it's a very, very natural reaction to the success of the operation drive the rook to a horrible square, because with the rook on b3 it becomes immediately a lot more attractive to start something on the king side because it's so misplaced. MVL took en passant. Instead of that, the only other move white could sort of make is queen b1, but nobody really plays like this. It's impossible, I think, in a practical game to make this move, and it's also not great because black can play c5, and I spent some time clicking around here. White doesn't lose, but he also does not enjoy this one bit. In general, the variations look very, very weird, and black objectively does really well here. For instance, after gf, bishop h5, knight h2, black takes on d4, bishop c1. And for instance, the computer suggests here that if you go bishop c5, there's even no real reason to protect the knight on e6, because d4, d3 will just give mate on the other side of the board. And white goes rook g3, black plays queen c7. Once again, you can generate lines like this by pressing spacebar at regular intervals all night long, but the end conclusion is this is probably holdable for white, but it's incredibly difficult to make a move like queen d1, b1 in real life. It's just not the way you operate in positions like this. So if EF is very, very natural. For a second there, I wondered whether Vishy's decision to start with bishop takes c2 here was an inaccuracy, and if queen takes f6 was perhaps slightly more precise. But it appears that it was just a different option, but I'm not sure if it was stronger. White has a choice of bishop takes g6, queen takes g6, and here knight e5 is horrible because of queen e8. This is a mistake. But the machine plays a3 first, and after bishop d6 goes knight h4, knight f5, and suggests that this is actually quite playable for white and no real harm has been done. Or you can start with knight e5, and after bishop d6, if black wants to avoid doing exactly what he did in the game, he should play bishop d6. And here, knight d7, queen h4 is pretty much losing for white, but bishop takes g6, h takes g6, and knight d7 here appears to be some sort of holding. Queen h4 takes, rook f8, king g2, a4, rook d3. Black is not really worse here because of his tremendous positional compensation, but white probably holds. Vishy took, queen c2, queen f6, knight e5, all very logical. And here, Vishy played a very exciting move, c7, c5. During the game, we were expecting bishop d6, and if white goes knight d7, which we thought was the best move, black is actually better with the following somewhat difficult line. Queen f3, we saw that. Knight f8, rook f8, bishop g5. But we sort of stopped here because we felt that this is a draw. Queen f7, bishop e3, and we assumed that the queen has to return to f3 immediately. But as a matter of fact, black can start by playing a4, rook d3. You cannot really take on b5 because now after queen f3 you have no way to stop queen takes h3. So rook d3 instead, queen f3, bishop g5. And by including a4 and rook d3, black gives himself an option to play queen e4 here. Once again the bishop is hanging, bishop e3, and black goes h7, h5 here. And once again, it's a full exchange, but just compare the king safety. Nobody really cares about material here. Black is, well, between better and winning. But after bishop d6, and probably the reason the reason why Vishy played c5 and not bishop d6, white has queen c6, a move we completely missed during the live show. And after, let's say, takes queen e5, rook d5, sorry, rook b5, rook d8, rook d1, rook d6, and queen c3. It's a position of the usual euphemism here is dynamic equality, but the machine suggests this is just equal. It doesn't look equal, it looks very unclear, but the machine suggests that the queens come off and then black has enough play despite some weaknesses on the queen side. c5 is a much more exciting option though. White of course has to go knight d7, and here once again we expected queen h4. Knight takes, rook takes, and here as it turns out white can just take on c5. And in this position, black basically needs to make a forced draw, which he does make by playing rook f3. Queen takes h3 is not great because white has a very strong reply in queen d1, protecting the g4 pawn and also hitting the pawn on d5. This is actually quite bad for black. But after rook f3, queen d1, and once again the only move needed to find, black needs to find the only move, rook g3 check, after which it is a perpetual takes, king f1 for instance, queen takes h3, and you should go back because if you try to run away towards the queen side, queen g2 check, king g3, there's a very beautiful geometric mate here, knight f4 check, bishop takes f4, and now that the e-file is free of pieces, the remaining two black pieces deliver very, very nice mate to the king on d3. So queen h4 doesn't lose, but neither does it win. And queen f7 is a very interesting attempt to do the same, only better, if you can describe it this way. And after knight f8, queen f8, once again, the position is objectively equal, but white needs to play very, very precisely. And MVL decides to bail out, but chooses sort of the wrong, the human option to bail out here. The correct way to make a draw here would have been to play a3. And now there are two ways to capture this rook on b3. You can play a4, rook d3, c4, ab, takes, queen f3, queen takes b5. And black can make an immediate draw by playing knight g5, bishop g5, and queen takes f2. Or he can take on h3, queen d5, queen g4, queen g2, queen f5. And despite black being some pawns down, white's king is so unsafe that black is never worse, but the machine says this is just equal. And the other way would be to play c4 here, ab, cb, queen takes b3. It's interesting to note that if white plays queen c6 here, which I originally thought was quite good, black plays a4, queen takes d5, and simply knight f4. And once again, white maybe even has more pawns right now, but the evaluation of this position is like -2 because of how strong this setup against this weakness. And sorry about my arrow drawing skills. Basically, every single endgame is lost for white because of how weak his pawn on b2 is long term. But queen takes b3 draws. Queen f3, queen d1, queen h3, and here white needs to play ba, but it's not a difficult move to make. Knight f4 takes, rook a3, and rook g3. And yes, black is a pawn up here and even starts giving checks first, but the passer on a5 is a more than sufficient compensation for white for all the inconveniences that will be caused. And in fact, the machine suggests that it's time to start giving perpetuals here. Instead of all this, MVL played queen f5. And here, Vishy actually made his maybe one mistake of the game. He played c takes d4, which should have led to an immediate draw. Instead of that, he could have played queen d7. I'm sure he had seen this move, but my assumption is after queen e5, c4, rook b4, and a b4, he couldn't correctly evaluate the position after bishop d2. Because white does attack the pawn on b4, also white is preparing to play rook e1. And maybe at first glance this position appeared to Vishy to be unclear. But with computer help, you realize that after h5, white is in quite some trouble. Bishop takes b4, rook f3 is just very, very bad for white. There's a lot of threats on the king side, more than you would think originally. The same applies to queen h5, knight d4. This is just horrible. Gh is bad because black plays queen f7, rook f1, and here the difference is with the pawn on h5, black has this option of playing queen f5, and for instance after bishop takes b4, queen takes e5, d, rook f5, the d pawn starts running, and once again nobody really is counting pawns. What you should be counting is the structures, and black's structure is very fluid, and all these pawns are targets. They will get picked up, and also black has a very, very strong passed pawn on the d file. h5 rook e1 is perhaps the best option white has here. And here, once again, the computer makes a move which would be extremely difficult to find in a practical game. c3, bc, bc. And he says that black is just better here. If you take knight f4 is quite strong, obviously. And after bishop c1, machine just goes knight d8, queen h5, knight c6, and says, once again, you can very much understand why Vishy wouldn't be able to correctly assess it. White is a pawn up here, and the evaluation is around -1 for white because this is weak. And g5, g6 never works because of queen f5. And actually it is going to be black who will have the biggest trump. Weakness on d4, very nice passer on c3, and initiative in the center. For instance, after bishop e3, queen e6. And you start perhaps seeing why the machine likes this so much for black. This pawn is coming here. Already knight takes d4 is once again a threat. Queen has a very nice potential square on e4. This is just not great for white at all. And queen d7 would have been a very strong option here. But instead, as I said, Vishy took on d4, queen f7, rook f7, and we come to the final turning point of the game, and I would argue maybe the least explicable of all the various things that happened in that game. Because MVL, I think, at this point had about 40 minutes to think for 11 moves, in a position where you can maybe make an argument that this is the final calculation he will need to make. And the fact that he spent about maybe 5 minutes to play rook takes b4 is shocking to me, to be honest. And I think it's an indication of how poor a form he is in this tournament, because not taking the time to calculate a3 is just an incredibly uncharacteristic mistake which MVL would normally not have made. If the bishop goes somewhere, it relinquishes control over this d2 square, so that's not really an option. And if you take on e3, ab, the one variation you perhaps need to calculate is e2, rook e3, knight d4. And here I think it would not have taken MVL very long to understand that rook e8, rook f8, takes, and b4 takes a5 is just immediately winning for white, because regardless of how black chooses to win this rook. The a pawn is just a queen. The knight is nowhere near fast enough to stop it. And there's really nothing else you need to calculate after d3, a b4. That's the only variation, because ef2, king f1, once again, simply common sense will tell you that this is very good for white. You don't really need to be even as good at calculating as MVL undoubtedly is to understand that this is unplayable for black. In view of all that, after knight c5, after a3, black has to go knight c5, and here white takes, a b4, bishop takes d4, knight b3, rook d1, let's say takes, rook f3, and the game would have been over by move 40 because there's just nothing left on the board. a3, frankly, did not require any kind of particularly difficult calculations, and had Maxim actually stopped to think properly here, he would have played a3 and the game would have been a draw. Instead, he took on b4, a b4, bishop d2. I have to assume he missed b3, which is a very strong move here. But objectively, even rook c7, bishop b4, rook c2 is quite good for black. Although, with this pawn structure, of course, white has a lot better chances. And let's say b3, knight f4, king f1, knight h3, bishop e1, d3, rook d1, knight f4, and a4. Lines like this, of course, do give white a very decent chance of holding. But it's not as if this is an easy, straightforward draw. You still will have to work here. So the decision not to really pause and think properly in this position was a very, very mysterious one to me. And after b3, white's position is even worse. You cannot allow rook a7, a3, rook c7, because then once again you will just lose to how weak your pawn on b2 is. Therefore, ab is the only move, rook f3. And here, there's really not a lot to say. It was possible to defend this position more tenaciously than MVL did, because he lost it with barely a whimper. But I think objectively it is pretty much gone. If you play something like king g2, rook d3, let's say rook d1, rook b3, and king f7, black is already a pawn up, and there's never any counterplay, because whenever you play f4, black has the option of going d3 and then bringing this knight over to e4. Black is just dominating here. And if you play rook a3, rook takes, and b4, the simplest way is just to take on a3. And this is, in the game, white got this exact endgame, but with a pawn on b2 and not on a3, which is obviously completely lost. But even this structure, because white will never really be able to create any kind of a passer on the queen side, there's not much different. And the computer suggests that simply playing g6, g5, king f7, and then knight d8, and coming out with the king is just completely winning for black. This is totally and utterly lost for white. MVL played b4. Rook d3 is the most precise move here, winning some tempi and some variations. Rook e1. If white goes bishop e1 instead, now you can take on h3, rook a6, king f7. And for instance, just to give an illustration of how bad this position is, the machine says that after rook d6, perhaps the cleanest way to win is to play h5, rook d5, hg, rook takes b5, and king f6. And now this is even a position of material balance. Black is no longer up any pawns. But the amount of threats he will generate, knight g5, knight f3 in some positions, knight f4 followed by rook d3, d1 in some positions, simply rook b3 followed by rook takes b1 and b2 in some positions, means that the whole thing is just completely lost for white. The machine suggests that this is not better, this is just utterly hopeless for white. MVL instead played rook e1, king f7, bishop c1, rook h3, and here the decision to play rook e5, rook d3, king f1 is basically a way to make sure the game doesn't last very far past move 40, because the endgame after takes, and frankly any move in this position is completely lost. During the show we were kind of surprised Vishy didn't play king f6, followed by g6 and h5, and for instance after f4, g6, white can really no longer stop h5 happening. But Vishy's choice of playing g6 MVL played f4, and even knight d8. It's a bit slower than other options. For instance, I said during the live show that Vishy did not really want to calculate something like this, but there is not a lot to calculate. Black can play f4, king f6, king g5, and king takes h5. And really, this knight on a6 is just so good at protecting the black pawns that, that the white basically can do nothing at all about this very, very simple plan, and this is a very resignable position for white. But going knight d8 to threaten h5 without even that counterplay with f5 available is also very simple. MVL played g5 and just resigned after king e6 because time control has been made, and after the possible king e2, king f5, king e3, knight e6, white will slowly but surely lose his entire king side. And if you play king f3 here, once again, there is a number of ways of winning this position, but I guess the simplest one is to play something like knight b7, followed by knight d6, bring the knight to e4, and then just go d3, d2, and win some kind of pawn ending. So a very, very nice victory for Vishy in round 7 of the Altibox Norway Chess 2018. With this result and all other games in round 7 drawn, we have a situation where we have 3 people on +1. With Ding out of the tournament, this means 3.5 out of 6 with 2 rounds to go. And with most of the field still really within touching distance of the leaders, what this means is that the last 2 rounds will be very, very exciting, and the tournament really is wide open now, and I guess we are probably mathematically favored to have tie breaks on June 8, which would be quite exciting to watch. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess 24.